lot of familiar faces, a lot of new faces. I'm Carl Ulrich. I'm Vice Dean of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at Wharton, and I oversee the San Francisco campus. I want to welcome you to what is our 9th Scale School event. The original idea goes back to one of our alums, Rick Thompson, who's the founder of Signia Ventures, who said, you know, so many universities are good at, as he put it, incubating the fruit flies, getting companies started. But few universities could really make their mark in helping companies to scale and grow. He said, I really think Wharton could stake out that position. And so that was really the impetus for Wharton Scale School. And we've convened these roughly every semester around themes or topics related to scaling new ventures. The basic format is that we have a moderator, usually a faculty member, who brings together a group of industry experts. We have some prepared remarks, and then we open up for discussion. So that's also our format tonight. Before I introduce our moderator, I want to just alert you to one logistical detail, which is this room now has these brand new speak-to-talk microphones, which alleviates one of the challenges we've had previously. The way they work, they're all on, but you push and hold to speak, okay? So just make sure you use them, because we're recording the session so that we can distribute it to those who can't make it. All right, so what I'd like to do is introduce our moderator for this evening, Professor Kartik Hosanagar. So Kartik, I think it's possible, this may be revisionist history, that I hired Kartik. At least I was in the room. I remember him giving the job talk. It was super interesting. I remember voting yes. So we hired Kartik in 2003. And Kartik has turned into a remarkable colleague. He's the John C. Hauer Professor at Wharton and also Professor of Operations and Information Management, which is the department I sit in. There's a few things that are really notable about Kartik. He teaches one of the most popular electives, probably most of the people in the room took it, which is why you're here, called Enabling Technologies. And in what I consider a move that makes the rest of us look bad, he has this really interesting of walking home from campus with students on most days. So if you want to talk to Kartik, you schedule time to walk home with him, and thus he's combined in a feat of amazing efficiency, exercise, teaching, work, all those things. I've considered adopting it, except I live across the street, and so it would be a very short walk. Kartik is also not just a professor, he's also a practitioner. So he has been a founder of several new ventures, including notably Yodle, which is a very successful business of which he was the co-founder and provided the original technology. And then most recently, I know because my Twitter feed is just overflowing with Kartik, not him, but his fans. He has a new book out called Human's Guide to Machine Intelligence. Super interesting book on algorithms, AI, and ordinary flesh and blood people like us. So with that, let's welcome Kartik Hosanagar.
Thanks so much, Carl. So, first of all, thank you all for being here. Great pleasure to be here with all of you. As Carl mentioned, my work at Wharton Research and Teaching is broadly focused on technology and digital business. And yes, I have a book that came out, and lately all I've been doing is tweeting and sharing about the book on LinkedIn. My publisher has me full-time focused on pushing the book sales right now. But I won't push it on you, at least not right now. I'll do it a little later today. As Carl mentioned, by the way, Carl, thank you for hiring me. As Carl mentioned, I joined in 2003. So when I joined Wharton, I was actually, I think, about 25. So I was younger than some of the MBA students I was teaching. So that first couple years was a bit unusual for me. And I didn't even get my PhD from a business school. So I was not even sure I have any business knowledge to teach MBA students. So I still remember my very first lecture. I walked into the classroom, and our students are all talking to each other. And I walked in early, and I'm eager to address them. And I've rehearsed the script, and I'm trying to address them, but nobody's listening to me. They're just talking to each other. And then it was a bit embarrassing, and I just went and sat down in the first row next to a student. And I don't know what possessed me. I turned to him and said, I heard this professor sucks. And then this student, I don't know, he was having a bad day, so he told me, oh, it's just my bad luck. I came from Professor so-and-so's class, and that person also sucks. And then after a while, students kind of settled down, were wondering where the professor is, and I finally stood up to address them, and this student had this look of sheer horror on his face for the next 80 minutes, and he never came back after that one session. So I've learned not to do those things since then. But coming back, so today we're going to talk about scaling businesses through automation and AI. So I'm going to get the discussion rolling. I'm going to set some initial context. I'm also going to talk about some risks with automated decisions. There's a lot of interest and conversation on algorithm bias and so on. So I do want to talk a little bit about that. And then I have three excellent panelists. I want to reserve most of the time for the panel discussion and for Q&A, and so we'll jump into that. So I'll introduce the panelists soon, but I'm going to initially just set up the agenda a little bit on automation and AI in particular. So my perspective on this was at least, if not informed, certainly initiated by a personal experience with co-founding Yodle. So Yodle was a marketing platform for small businesses. So we helped small, hyper-local businesses advertise on Google and other digital platforms. And I helped develop the algorithms to figure out what keywords to bid on, how to bid on it. And one of my co-founders, Ben, did the sales. He went and signed up small local businesses. Another co-founder, Nathaniel, he was the initial CEO. He did operations. He did the account management and so on. And when we were initially trying to build this business and we were trying to convince VCs to invest in the company, the reaction or the response from at least the first couple dozen VCs we spoke to was always, this business is not scalable. What you're doing is interesting. It's working in Philly. You have clients in Philly, but this is not replicable. It's a good lifestyle business. Run it like that. And we tried to convince them that we had grown this in 1 year to $1 million run rate business. We were cash flow positive, and what we have done in Philly was repeatable and replicable across the US and therefore could be scaled. Eventually, Bessemer signed on. And when Bessemer invested in us, we had 6 employees. We had $1 million run rate. We sold the company roughly 10 years later. At that point, we had about 1,200 employees, a little over $200 million run rate. Now, what's interesting about this is that I said $1 million run rate, 6 employees. $200 million run rate, 1,200 employees. 200 times 6, 1,200. So we had indeed created a model that we could just replicate, and we, in fact, repeated what we did in the first year 200 times effectively in some ways to grow the business. But as I've reflected on the business in the last 4 or 5 years, one of the things I've realized is that we did create something that was replicable, but we did a really poor job in terms of using data science and algorithms to scale faster and more efficiently. For example, we had processes for sales, for customer onboarding, for customer services, and we just repeated that in every market. We repeated the same process, and our approach to scaling was to throw more bodies in, right, and repeating what we did. And it worked to some extent. It worked quite well, but I think there was a bigger opportunity in terms of leveraging data science, and I think that's one of the themes I want to explore today. And the guiding statement I'm going to use in our discussion today is pretty much that what works in the startup phase, meaning in the product market fit phase, can actually come in the way of scaling up. As an example, Ben Silbermann, who is the co-founder of or founder of Pinterest, famously actually emailed every one of the first 5,000 users of Pinterest and actually had conversations with many of those customers. They had a cell phone number. They could talk to him. And that was how he found product market fit, really understanding deeply what these 5,000 people cared about. And it really helped with product market fit. But that same approach would not work to get the next 5,000 and the 5,000 after that. It simply doesn't scale, right? And so the question is, how does one use automation, whether it's for customer acquisition, customer servicing, recruiting, and so on. And that's one of the themes we want to talk about. In other words, what might be a playbook for using AI and data science and automation for scaling? I think a lot of the answers are going to really come from our panelists, and we'll try and get the answers from them. But in terms of thinking about the playbook, I want to set up a couple things. The first is looking at how maybe a large company did this or does this, and then talking a little bit about how small companies have done this. And so in looking at large companies, and I was thinking about, what's a company that's really invested heavily in AI and kind of made that a centerpiece. What's interesting is, of course, Google. Google announced a few years back that we want to be an AI-first company. And so that's really interesting because Google had previously said we want to be a mobile-first company, and now they said we want to be an AI-first company. And so the question is, what does that mean? And certainly that meant Google acquired companies like DeepMind. They did things like Google Brain Project. They announced big initiatives like autonomous vehicles. But it was much more than that. So for example, Sundar Pichai said that we want to apply it across all our products, be it search, ads, YouTube, or Google Play, or what have you, right? And also this meant that you have a company with 25,000 engineers, almost all of whom were trained in computer science during a time when machine learning was not such a big deal, who needed to be retrained with machine learning. So it was a massive undertaking for the company. And I think they did it in a very interesting way. So first, they didn't just say that AI, being an AI-first company is doing autonomous vehicles and doing a few big projects with AI, but it's really about diffusing it all through the organization. So they had this, the Machine Learning Ninja kind of initiative, which is lots of in-person and online courses to train their engineers in machine learning. They actually had an initiative where they told any engineer you can take 6 months off to join a centralized machine learning team, work with a mentor on a machine learning project, and then go back to your team. And the great thing that happened for them through that was that all these people came in from different product teams. They went back to the product teams, and now machine learning knowledge was no longer centralized within one team. It was actually a decentralized knowledge base within the entire organization. And so they invested very heavily in training these engineers. The other thing that I thought they did that was quite interesting was it was not just big, large projects, but lots of small projects. So one of the things they said was every team has to launch some AI initiative. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't even have to have ROI. Just launch something. Because the goal is, let's understand what it takes to gather data, analyze data, and so on, right? And so let's do that. So Gmail said, okay, of course, spam. We'll look at spam. That makes so much sense. But once people get comfortable with that, they kind of say, okay, maybe I can do smart replies. I start suggesting what the response should be. The data center team said, let's predict what our energy usage will be tomorrow or a few hours from now based on weather, temperature, pressure, air pressure predictions. And once they did that, they kind of said, okay, we can do that well. Can we start controlling the data center's energy usage through machine learning? And of course, you might know that energy usage is actually a big portion of the cost of running a data center. And in fact, when they did that, they were able to bring the cost down by 40% when they rolled this out. And over time, they've kind of created an environment where it's actually in the organizational DNA. It's not a few big AI projects, but really it's diffused throughout, right? And so the question is, we want to create organizational learning. We want to have a portfolio company approach. We want to have it diffused throughout. Google did that well, but can a small company that's trying to scale do that as well, right? And I think there's one main trend that I want to share here before moving on, which is a pretty important trend that has happened in data science and machine learning in the last 2-3 years, and that's the democratization of machine learning. If you look at the hardware to do machine learning, if you look at the software to do machine learning, if you look at the data sets, algorithms, all of them are becoming democratized. So suppose we look at the hardware to do machine learning. You have specialized chipsets that are available to do machine learning. And earlier, it was the large companies that had access to that. But now they're available in all of the cloud computing data centers, and one can just rent it and pay a simple usage-based fee, and so you've got access to that. And one can use it to automate a lot of things and also run some pretty big data science or machine learning kinds of initiatives. If you look at the software side, there's so much of this being open sourced by many of the large companies that have created custom software to be able to do machine learning. And I mentioned a few here, and certainly there's many of these tools available, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can actually start off with existing software, including some software that is almost has a nice graphic user interface, so it's almost created for somebody who's not a data scientist, but who wants to play around with data. And then you've got the marketplaces for data, for algorithms, and for tools. So you've got marketplaces like Kaggle for data sets. You wanted data sets to train an image recognition algorithm, but you don't have enough image data, just go download a data set, and you've got the data set to start with. You want an algorithm that is pre-trained to do image recognition. You can, again, download that from Algorithmia and other such marketplaces. So there's so much available that the entry barrier has really gone down. And so it's very easy for companies to now start building. But not only can they build, it's easier to buy as well. And so there's lots of vendors out there that are providing tools for automation, and I'm sure all of you have used at least some of these tools. Whether it is like you want to do sales development, there's tools like SalesLoft and Outreach that can automate a lot of the sales engagement and following up with your leads and so on. You want to do marketing automation, there's Marketo and HubSpot and many other players for that. Email automation, customer retention, customer servicing. You want to have a chatbot to interact with customers as your first line of interaction on your website. You've got tools like Zendesk and many others available for that. So there's a lot of tools out there, and so one doesn't even need to build a lot of this stuff that is available to users. So I think bottom line, I think we're at a point where a lot of tools and infrastructure one needs to automate processes are available. An interesting question is, do you build or you buy? But you've got great options for both. And I think that's something we'll explore a little bit more. And that's going to be a big theme of our discussion. At least I'll kickstart it by talking about some of these tools and what's available, what works, what doesn't, and so on. Now, while I've kind of said, hey, there's this huge opportunity with automation, and it's foolish not to take advantage of that, there's also emerging risks, and we're only waking up to that now. And I think this is going to become more and more important and salient as we go on over the next few years. And we've seen a few examples of that. For example, late last year, there was this story in Reuters about Amazon trying to use automated resume screening algorithms. Again, the problem is very obvious. Amazon hired over 100,000 people in 1 year, probably received million-plus job applications. You can't have human recruiters sift through that many resumes and figure out who to hire. And so it makes sense to automate that. But the Reuters story reported that the system had a gender bias, and they tried to get rid of the gender bias in many ways, but they couldn't rid the system of gender bias, because at the end of the day, it's a machine learning system. It's using past data to make decisions. The past data is full of gender biases, and so how do you debias that system is extremely challenging. And so eventually they decided, at least the report said that Amazon decided not to roll this out and shut down that project. I'm not convinced they shut it down. But it's, I suspect work in progress. But bottom line, Amazon is a savvy company, new to run these tests. But there's many companies that have resume screening applications or other recruiting automation tools and one has to worry about these kinds of issues. Similarly, if you look at, there was this big story 2 years back by ProPublica about algorithms used in courtrooms in the US to guide judges and parole officers in terms of, it would compute recidivism scores. What is the likelihood that this defendant will reoffend in the next 5 years or next 10 years? And judges use those algorithmic predictions to decide, does this person get parole? Does this person get 5 years or 10 years? And it turned out that an analysis showed that the algorithm had a race bias. It was twice as likely to falsely predict future criminality in black defendants than white defendants. And it was used in courtrooms in Florida at the time of that analysis. And that's just one example. There's many more. There was a study by a research group in Georgia Tech earlier this year, in fact, just last month, looking at the image recognition algorithms used in most of the popular automated vehicles, autonomous vehicles. And what they found was that these image recognition algorithms were less likely to recognize people with dark skin than, light skin. Since then, I keep my distance when I see Google's driverless cars near me. We see a lot of them over here. But that's one example. There's many more. I could go on. We all know about Microsoft Tay, the chatbot that turned racist, sexist, fascist, and every other ist, right? And of course, they tested it. And now you think about rolling out chatbots in different settings, and it's abusing a customer. One has to worry about that, right? There's the famous story of Target with its segmentation algorithm, predicting that this teenager is pregnant and informing the parent. I don't know if that's true, but it's widely reported, including in New York Times. And so there's all these risks one runs with automation. I think there are social risks. We've talked about some of these. There's reputational risks for companies. If it comes out that you're making biased automated decisions. There are litigation risks. There are regulatory risks. Already there are some candidates who are kind of saying, we're going to come hard at tech companies and so on. And so there's all kinds of risks when this automation goes awry. And so one has to worry about that as well. So I think I think there's a huge opportunity in terms of automation, but at the same time, I think execs and boards should look at algorithmic risks as well. And one of the things I advocate is to have an audit process in place where every algorithm that is in a consequential setting is audited by a team that is independent of the team that developed the algorithm. Almost every setting you go to, the algorithm is tested and validated by the people who developed the algorithm. And so you will not catch things you're not thinking of when you're designing it. You'll catch the obvious bugs. So I think it's valuable to, and almost instructive to have it validated by independent teams. So I think there's many issues and themes to really think about here. And I just wanted to set that in terms of the lay of the land. There's many themes to explore, and I'd ideally like to do it with our panelists. So I think this is a good time to invite the panelists. So Stacy, Gaurav, and Ashu, please join me here. Okay, so what I'm going to try and do is just kickstart this conversation, and then we'll open it up, and we'll see where people want to take this conversation. And one of the places I want to begin with is just looking at what is out there in terms of tools and opportunities for automation. And let's start with the buy option, which is the easier option. And and we'll start with that. But before I do that, I'm going to very quickly ask each of you to introduce yourself. So Stacy, who is CEO of Zinc, Gaurav, who is founder and CEO of Socio Advocacy, and Ashu Garg, who's a partner at Foundation Capital. So maybe Stacy, you can get started. Share a little bit about your background and the perspective you bring here, and then we'll jump in.
Sure. So first of all, the title's wrong because my company was acquired a few weeks ago. So
Congratulations.
Thank you. So I am not the CEO of Zinc anymore. I am now the president of Zinc at ServiceMax. So I've been in enterprise software for 30 years. My background is marketing. I was actually the first marketer at a company called Success Factors. Some of you are too young to remember Success Factors. Very early cloud enterprise software company. And I built the marketing function, was there about 6 years through the IPO. They were bought by SAP for $3.5 billion. And then I actually went to ServiceMax, who acquired us, and that's another story for another time. And started the marketing function there, was there for about 6 years. ServiceMax was acquired by GE, and then recently spun out and bought by Silver Lake. But I had left ServiceMax and gone to start a company called Zinc about 3 years ago. Zinc is a employee communication platform, and it's focused on field service workers. So imagine, the Dish Network guy that's coming to install cable at your home, and it gives them a platform to communicate with each other, share tribal knowledge, and really get the job done faster because they can communicate. And that's kind of my background.
Okay, thank you, Gaurav.
Hello, everyone. I'm Gaurav Mediratta. I'm a Penn alum, graduate in engineering from 2005. I've been in technology and marketing for the last 13 plus years. I've been running Social Squares for the last 7 years. We are a digital marketing company, and we help companies convert their employees into brand ambassadors, primarily on social media, so by content, technology, and personalization. So that's what I do.
I'm Ashu Garg. I'm a partner at Foundation Capital. We're an early-stage venture capital firm. We've been in business for 25 years. We're actually the first investor in Success Factors probably 20 years ago. But I've also been investors in Netflix and 28 other companies that have gone on to be public over the years. I've been with the firm for 11 years. I lead the charge in all things sort of applying machine learning to the enterprise. I've invested in a dozen companies up and down sort of the infrastructure and application stack in machine learning, going back 10 years. Really got into the space mostly because I was running the ads business at Microsoft, and behavioral targeting was the killer app for machine learning if you go back 10, 15 years ago, and that's sort of where I sort of learned what the word machine learning actually meant. And that's it.
Okay, thank you.
You said we should keep it to a minute, so. We got strict instructions from Kartik before we started.
Yeah, I said introductions under a minute, and I especially said that to Ashu because I told him VCs have a way of going over. But I appreciate that. So I think in terms of getting started, a good place to start is, I think, just getting a sense of the lay of the land. Let's start with where I see a lot of automation, which is the go-to-market, marketing and sales. And Gaurav, you're in the marketing space. You've been there for a while. So can you give us, I see there's a lot of tools, but I don't have a good sense of, what's the big picture in terms of what's available, what are the different functions in marketing and sales where there's automation available, and what does it do for, marketing and sales teams? So can you just give us that high-level sense?
Sure. So when it comes to go-to-market, I think we can break down things into 4 verticals. So starting with ad tech. Within ad tech, there are 2 pillars. So there are the standard platforms, Google advertising, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, depending on what platform makes sense for your business. There are automations available through these platforms itself. And then there are overlay applications as well, or products as well. For example, Kensho or Marin or AdExpresso, which will let you automate your ads across Google, LinkedIn, and others. Then there is display advertising at scale through programmatic buying. That also falls under ad tech. And there are platforms like AdRoll, which are primarily for startups and small businesses. And then there are bigger platforms like MediaMath and InMobi and so on. But ad tech, as a vertical, it's only one pillar, and there are 3 more to look at. So after that, another important platform is email. So email marketing and creating landing pages, optimizing that. And MailChimp is the most popular tool used in that. Followed by organic stuff, so SEO and social media. And there are a bunch of platforms which help you optimize your site for search engines. Social media, I think we are all familiar with. There are platforms like Hootsuite and others which will help you from a tech perspective, but you need to get your content right as well. Finally, the 4th pillar is on the sales side, where you have to get your lead nurturing in place, and you need a CRM, which could be HubSpot or Salesforce. So that's what I would say. These are the 4 verticals you can think about.
Okay. So that's a good place to begin, but I think automation could mean things beyond marketing and sales. Ashu, I know for your company and you in particular, your investment thesis is around automation and AI. So tell us, I'm sure over the years you've invested a lot in martech and ad tech companies, but beyond that, what else is going on in terms of automating within the enterprise?
So ad tech and martech were the obvious sort of sectors in the early days for AI, and sort of, a lot of us in the space sort of, earned our chops sort of there. But more broadly, if you take a step back and you think about any task, white collar or blue collar, that's done by 1 million people or more, and is somewhat repeatable, that's subject to automation. Just customer support, customer success, recruiting, driving, I could just go on and on. So just think about anything, restaurants. Now, white-collar tasks generally require NLP technology, and so the white-collar tasks actually have been automated, are being automated more recently. The blue-collar tasks, and these are gross generalizations, are more computer vision problems, and the technology stack there is actually much more advanced. So in some ways, blue-collar tasks are easier to automate at this point in time, but the societal implications are very different, and which is why sort of, a lot of those things actually haven't been implemented. The white-collar tasks, the societal implications, at least from a regulatory standpoint, are much easier to manage. No one really complains if customer support people get put out of jobs, at least in the short term. I don't mean to sound crass, but that's sort of the reality of machine learning and AI. And so when I think about it, I think about customer success, massive space. I think all things related to HR. I think a lot of things that are, if you think about HR even more broadly defined, therapy, counseling, a bot is a better person to talk to than most human beings, so why do you need people?
Okay, I don't even know how to react to that.
I can debate that.
Oh, we can all debate that, but I don't want to go there. That's a conversation after a drink, maybe later tonight. Okay, so I think I take your point that there's a lot that can be automated, and your investment thesis is built around going beyond martech, ad tech, and looking at things like, let's say, recruiting. I know, for example, you guys are even into like software development and looking at automation of
automation of testing, automated code generation. Eventually all software engineers, it's a repeatable task that has more than 1 million people.
Okay, so there's a lot of tools out there. So Stacy, something I want to ask you, I think you're in a unique position having used many of these tools, scaled multiple enterprises. These tools are available to everyone. So what does it take to get real return from these tools? So what does one need to have in place? They're enablers. What else do you need in place to be able to scale?
Yeah. So I'm sure everybody has heard the phrase garbage in, garbage out. And I think it really applies here when we're talking about AI or even any kind of automation that's trying to help scale, whether it's AI or machine learning or not. And Ashu mentioned something that's repeatable. And I think a lot of times we just jump to, wouldn't it be better if I could just automate this? But you didn't really perfect what this is first. And I think that's when he brought up the slides of the Amazon bot that was doing hiring. Well, they were just replicating what Amazon had already been doing, which was hiring with a gender bias. The machine didn't make that up. It got it from the learning that it did about what Amazon had already been doing. And you could look at really any function. I mean, I look at it I'll give a couple of real world examples. One is there's, in some of his categories, if you look at marketing and sales, if you look at something like SalesLoft, or even Marketo, that is basically like, okay, we score these leads and then we're gonna do an action based on this lead. And typically what you gotta put into those actions is content, right? So if the person did 5 different things, they must be qualified and therefore they're gonna get this email. Great, but did you actually even look at the email that you're sending, right? Like, there's so many times I'll go in SalesLoft and I'll look at like what my team has programmed to be this flow of what happens, and it's like, it's actually not something we should replicate, right? And so I think like technology is so cool and AI is so cool, and we think, oh, we're going to replicate, we're going to, a million people are doing this, let's go do this, but you forget that like you got to make sure what you're doing is the thing that's working. And just like a totally non-sales and marketing example, which is more relevant to Zinc, is field service. So we have Exelon, which is a big, you guys probably know Exelon because a lot of you went to Wharton, I would assume, so you're out in that neck of the woods. Exelon's a big, huge utility company. And what their guys do is they go out in the field and they fix transformers, right? Now they want to do machine learning, and we're working with them on, okay, whenever there's a leaking transformer, take a picture of it. And we're going to put that into a model, and we're going to train the model, and the model's going to know what to do with every type of situation that comes up with a transformer. And it's actually working quite well because there are only so many things that can happen to a transformer, right? So you, like make sure this is working, is fairly replicable, okay? So you train the model, and now any technician, whether he's 3 months on the job or 10 years on the job, can get this AI that tells him, oh, it's that, then do this. Different kind of customer, Dish Network, which I mentioned earlier. When a Dish Network technician comes to your house to install the satellite, there are endless possibilities for what he might face because your wiring is different and your roof is different and you as a person and how you react to him is different, and you might be like abusing your dog in the house and he needs to know how to handle it. There's so many scenarios for Dish that AI is probably just not, and other than specifically their product, it would be hard for them to really leverage AI in the way that somebody like Exelon can. So my advice is, it's a little old school, but like before you go and jump to the technology, you got to make sure that what you are doing as a business or as a strategy is the right one, and then that's what goes in, and so it's not garbage in, it's good replicable stuff in, and then you get the return coming out.
I was going to just add on to what Stacy said. I mean, I think, I deliberately gave a little bit of a flippant answer in sort of the spectrum of opportunity. All of that is true. I think the reality is that we don't have general AI, and we have very use case specific AI technologies and tools. And so you really have to find problems that can be bounded. And so you have to define an input and an output to the problem in a way that you can then model it. The models are getting better and the computational power is getting modeled, but still it's a model. So you have to figure out conceptually, can this be modeled? That's one thing. The second thing you've got to look for is the data set available? And I think on that side, actually, the technology is improving at a remarkably fast clip. And so the size of data, you needed terabytes of data to train models. Today, you can do that with megabytes of data. But the third part is you have to find a point of insertion. These are not binary problems. You can't say there's a human being, I'm going to pull the human being out of the problem, and I'm going to put in a bot. It doesn't work that way. And so the genius in AI sort of solutions is really around the product definition. As much as the technology, you have to find a point of insertion where you can say, I'm going to automate 10% of the task, or 10% of the tasks in a workflow, or in machine learning terms, in a data pipeline. I'm going to take this 10% and automate it, and the automation of that 10% is worth enough to be able to sell a product. And then you can go automate the next 5% and the next 5% and so on and so forth. And yes, at some point, doctors and therapists will all become bots, but that may be 10, 20 years away. You have to find sort of an on-ramp to that 20-year journey for your company.
Yeah, it's interesting as you're describing that. I almost also feel something that my reaction when I see a lot of these companies that say this is AI we have, right? And you're talking about bounded problems, inputs, outputs. Half the time it's not really AI, right? It's like a simple old school regression model or things like that, and it's. So the question, as you kind of invest in these companies, what's your sort of take on what's the differentiator here?
Well, at the point that they start using language that I don't understand, it's probably it's probably real technology at that point.
That's your thesis? That's
That's
how
my
you invest? Take note.
On a serious note,
I have a business plan for you. Let's talk
on a
about
serious
that.
note, I think you're asking an important question, and there's no binary answer. There's no black and white answer. I think the question we ask ourselves is, why does this company deserve to exist 10 years from now? And it's either very few companies will deserve to exist because they have a machine learning model or an algorithm that has that kind of lead. I mean, I'm looking at a company as we speak, and it's actually a team out of MIT, and they think they have a 3 to 4 year advantage. And that's the best I've heard. Most cases, you have a 3-month advantage on the models. So it usually ends up being an advantage on the workflow that eventually you build around the models, or the data sets you acquire, or just the fact that enterprises have inertia. There's no inherent advantage in using one workflow application, yet the world continues to use ServiceMax. If you started using it, well, it's a great product, it works, why would I change?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that a lot of these tools are available, as I was saying, even data sets, algorithms, and so on. So in that sense, the playing field is even, but maybe the differentiation often comes from the people in the team. But I want to also ask Stacy something I was curious about, which is about a build versus buy. So how do you think about what should I hire a data science team for? What do I want to do internally? Versus kind of say, this, I don't need to have the expertise in-house to do this?
It's a great question. I'll use the Exelon example again. Like, there's, maybe it's their own transformer. That process of fixing their own transformer is absolutely unique to them. And it's probably we will be a platform to help them do that, but it's all their photos that are going into the model, right? They're not buying the model from somebody else. But if you look at something like recruiting, there's a company called Maya. Do you know Maya? They're in the...
One of our investments.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that. Well,
thank you for the
killing
advertisement.
it. But they're basically like a recruiting bot. So if you're a Walmart or a company that does just zillions, you get so many applications you can't handle. You'd have to hire just boatloads of people just to bring the applications in. And they do the whole first round of oh, thank you for the application. When are you available for an interview? And they ask all those relatively common questions that a lot of companies need to ask in a sales cycle, right? So that's something where a lot of companies can go take advantage of Maya because it's quite common across multiple industries or companies. Nobody else could use that same model that Exelon needs because it is their proprietary process.
I have a slightly different take on that, and that's specific to marketing, though. And going back to the old point you made, which was garbage in and garbage out, right? I mean, we are talking about savvy companies who would have tested a model and then tried to scale it, right? It worked in a test environment, or it worked to some scale, and then it stopped working, right? And a classic example would be an email marketing campaign, right? It worked to an audience of 10,000, but when you went to 100,000, you didn't get the same numbers, or you got the same percentage, but the numbers are not looking good anymore, right? And then we look at what is out there to summarize content, create better content. And there are very few tools out there, right? And the best tool can't write an email which is personalized to every individual person you're sending to. So I would say a combination of buy and then build on top might work better. So we did recently for a summarization algorithm where we are working with a third-party API which is already doing the basic level summarization of content, and then we are adding NLG, which is natural language generation, on top of that to improve the summaries. So a combination might be a solution sometimes.
And maybe that's the way you differentiate as well. I'm taking this conversation down a certain path, and maybe that's not the path you guys want to go down. So I think this is a good time for me to just see if people have comments, questions, and then we can take this in whichever direction. Yes.
Yeah, I wrote down a note, so I didn't forget. I
Can you use the mic?
There we go. Can everyone hear me? Okay, cool.
It's much better. Yeah.
So I'm interested in AI for personalization.
Push and hold it.
Oh, there we go.
You keep holding.
I'm gonna start
Task
sweating. I'm gonna
automation.
start sweating.
Repetitive human task.
So AI for personalization, there's that creepiness factor, right? We all seen those ads that pop out and you're just like, how do they know? How do you restrain, how do you restrain AI, keep, and not keep it from going into, like, how do you, let me see, how do you withhold and hinder AI from making it that creepiness factor? Like, how can I phrase this better? How do you not make it creepy and program that into the AI? Let's put it that way.
Yeah,
Like, how do you restrain AI from making that creepiness factor?
I can
Does that make
comment on
sense?
that.
I don't take a stab. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I understand I think we all understand what
Yeah.
you're saying.
In short, actually, you can read Kartik's book on that.
Oh, okay.
His book has this thesis of Bill of Rights for technology companies and implementation of AI, where, and I mean, obviously he can talk at length about it, but
You're hired as my publicist. You're hired. There
I
you
just
go.
finished this book, that's why I remember it so well. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I think, my take on it is, as individuals, as consumers, we need some checks and balances in place, and we haven't had those in place. And so I've advocated in my book that we should have certain checks and balances in place. There's an op-ed coming in New York Times tomorrow where I actually talk about this. So you'll see more about that. So I don't want to give it away, but I think there's a lot of questions about, are we allowed to see the data that companies have about us? Google, for example, will let you go in through tools to see what does Google know about us, and allows us to change and say, don't unlearn this. So do we have control over, can we delete stuff? Can we tell companies, forget that you know this? Are they allowed to share it? Who do they share it with? What decisions do they make with us? Transparency is really what I'm talking about. There are some regulations. The most well-known, of course, is Europe's GDPR, which comes in with a very heavy hand that says, you have to abide by this long set of rules, and if you don't, the penalty can be as much as 4% of your global revenues, which is huge. But that also means compliance is very burdensome for companies. I don't think we're there in the US, but California has probably the most progressive privacy act in the US.
Or aggressive.
Or aggressive. But my point is that if companies are not careful about this, you might have GDPR-like solutions, which would be a huge disaster for the industry. And so the industry needs to wake up to some of these things and self-regulate. And I think some of that needs to happen as well. But I feel regulation is coming just because of the push, and you just need, look at some of the things that Senator Wharton is proposing. I think some of that is going to happen. But I think there's also technical side of this. I just now mentioned the policy side. There's the engineering side of it. There's a lot of work on privacy preserving approaches to sharing data, to acting on, to making decisions. There's also questions on algorithm interpretability. So when you make decisions, can we, and it's a neural net or a black box algorithm, can we provide users with information on why the decision was what it was? So I think there's also lots of technical solutions here. But yeah, more in New York Times op-ed and much more in my book.
I think the creepy one is Google Mail, Gmail, when it tells you it gives you the examples of what you should respond. And I'm like, I must be a really boring conversationalist because it always knows what I want to say.
But that's automation I love, by the way. I never find that creepy. But I'm glad they're no longer reading emails to personalize ads, right? That, again, was because of push from GDPR in Europe that they changed it for Europe, and then they said, we'll roll it out globally, right?
But they're still using it. So I recently published a video on YouTube, and this morning I see a Gmail ad saying that, okay, do you want to promote your YouTube video? So, I mean, they're using the data they get from all their other platforms in Gmail promotions. So.
Fair enough. Yes, there's a question back there.
So there was a lot of discussion about repetitiveness and that we are putting in deliberately, right? What is the industry doing to humanize it beyond just, to actually use the intelligence and learning piece of it, to humanize, to include objectivity, to deliberately include it, and not just focus on repetitive tasks, which is what I think are inadvertently including the bias that we are talking about. Is there any effort going on towards humanizing more and including objectivity into algorithms as well?
So to be clear, when I'm saying repetitive tasks, I mean, they are objective. And the way and again, this is a biased point of view, so with that caveat, I think AI will free us to be human. It will take the repetitive tasks out of our lives, whether it's driving or, customer support, or so many things that we do that aren't that interesting. I mean, not that many customer support reps look at it and say, look, wow, I had such an amazing day. I answered the same question 150 times. So we'll automate that, and it will be objective. And as humans, we have, for thousands of years, found more interesting things to do with our time. And half of society did, farming. 5% of society does farming. We found other things. 5 to 8% of society today does some sort of customer support task. In 10 years, it'll be 0, but there'll be new jobs for humans.
I think there's another aspect to this when you said biases and then subjectivity and how do we humanize it and bring in, it sounded like some ethical notions. So within AI, there's this whole area that's emerging, which is called ethical AI, and within machine learning, there's an area called FATML, and there's a conference on FATML. FATML stands for Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency in Machine Learning. And so that's focused on how do you incorporate some certain notions on fairness and ethics within machine learning algorithms itself so that it can automatically detect it. So when we are seeing some of these problems, I worry sometimes that a lot of the conversation is so much on fear-mongering. I think these are very addressable problems, and that they will be addressed soon. And the other thing I want to mention is also that there's a design mindset and an approach that a lot of product designers have, which is let's make it autonomous. The less the user has to think about it, the better. And I think that's not good because I think autonomous is good in many senses, but especially when we're talking about AI, completely keeping the user, making the user that passive in terms of how they use technology, I think can also create problems. I think having a human in the loop is useful. And ways to engage the human in the process is useful. So for example, you look at Facebook and they had the fake news issue 2 years back. 2 years back, there was no way for a person who noticed that there's fake news or offensive content in my feed to inform the algorithm and say this content is problematic. Today, with 2 clicks, we can let them know. So having the user play a role. Tesla, they had this AV crash 2-3 years back. Today, if you're not engaging, you have to re-engage and put your hand on the wheel. I forget whether it's every minute or 2 minutes or whatever, periodically. But if you don't, then there's a beep. And I think the idea is don't eliminate the human in the loop. So I think the design mindset is also going to have to change to have them work better with humans. I don't think the solution is complete, or at least in every setting, make it completely autonomous. Yes, a question there, and then I'll come here.
So it seems like a lot of the conversation is veering into what AI should be, and that's a fine conversation to have, but perhaps in some sense more technical than at least what I expected. Maybe you folks up there can speak about, okay, how do you actually incorporate AI into your business to scale it more effectively? I mean, is it as simple as, gee, after a while you realize we could automate X, you do a Google search, see who makes something to automate that, and then you take those meetings? Or, from sort of a managerial operational strategy, how do you think about what should I automate? When should I automate? Should I buy or build? Is there a general approach to that? Yeah.
I mean, that's a great question. And I'm not sure I have a perfect answer. I mean, I can tell you how we've done it, and coming from a small startup and then also having worked for bigger companies, I think part of it is just making sure you're kind of familiar with the landscape, and the landscape changes so frequently that it's hard to keep up. But I think the obvious go-tos, unless you're an organization like Exelon and you've got like transformers and that's happening out of their innovation team. But for just a typical company, I think the low-hanging fruit is probably HR and marketing / go-to-market. And there's there's some cool technologies that you can, that I'm trying to think of even how they come in. I think you look at the processes that you want to perfect and you want to repeat, and there's probably a company out there that's doing something like that. I mean, look at Marketo, right? They took off because that whole moving a lead through the funnel was something that was very manual, and it took somebody looking at the data. And then Marketo came along and said, no, we'll score your leads for you, and we'll only surface the really qualified ones, and then your people are only working on those leads. So to me, I think the low-hanging fruit for an organization is probably go-to-market and HR. And then again, if you're a manufacturing company, you probably are going to have to start looking at a platform to potentially build it on top of.
So the thing I would add to that is I think look for business processes where not only is there a cost benefit for you as a corporation, but to the participants in the process, you can deliver more value. I think that's what makes AI more palatable, and HR is one of them. I mean, no candidate ever said, I had a great recruiting experience. And no hiring manager has ever said, I really enjoy the process of hiring. So you have this massive industry where there's $200 billion of spend, roughly another $250 to $300 billion of time spent by hiring managers. So $500 billion is spent, give or take. And 95% of candidates and 95% of hiring managers are unhappy with their experience in the process. So that's a perfect example for automation. Maya is an example of someone that automates the interviewing process, mostly for blue-collar jobs. We have another portfolio company, Eightfold, that actually takes a system-wide view, mostly for white-collar jobs, and automates a lot of the tasks involved in white-collar recruiting. There's a handful of other companies in that space. Customer support is another process. No agent enjoys their job. No one's ever happy with customer support. So there's value created for all participants in that process. If you're a very large software company, managing production software. I mean, you have thousands and thousands in a large company of what are called SREs, or prod support, or cloud operations support. So people who manage the operational components of production software, tasked to be automated. To take your, the Exelon example of sort of field workers that are looking at, again, it's a task. I doubt the person going out sort of in the winter, it's sort of minus 10 degrees in Philly is particularly happy about having to do that.
I can give you a tactical example in marketing specifically. So let's say you're a startup, you're just starting out on your marketing campaigns, and you don't have a specialist in Google or specialist in email marketing. Today, Google and MailChimp have made it easy to not only use their platforms, but they have included AI both in bidding, making sure your ads are showing up for the right keywords. So with Google Smart Bidding, you don't need to worry about did you select the right keywords or not. You just need to make sure that your ad copy looks okay. You don't need to worry about, okay, am I bidding the right amount or not? You just say, Google, this is my budget. I want maximum conversions, or I want the maximum return on my advertising spend. And Google will handle that part for you. When it comes to email marketing, you might have 2,000 contacts, or 10,000 contacts, or 100,000. When it comes to email marketing, segmentation plays a big role. Just sending one email blast doesn't ever suffice. It typically takes 7 to 13 introductions to a potential lead for them to get familiar with your brand. So MailChimp can do that marketing automation part for you, where you just set the campaign in a way that, okay, these are the 5 emails I would like to send in this sequence. You segment it, and MailChimp will do that for you.
So regarding your question about what should we do with AI, just a couple, not really a framework, but a couple, I guess, learnings I've had from interacting with multiple companies in terms of what should we do with AI. One is, I think one interesting place to start is identifying the data assets within the organization. I think sometimes when I talk to companies, they don't know what are the data assets. So that's a good place, come up with an inventory of what are the data assets available. The other is rather than coming top down and saying, here's this big initiative we want to do with AI, source ideas from all over on what is it your team wants to do with AI, and you come up with all these ideas. In fact, Carl has this great idea of, within entrepreneurship, which is innovation tournaments. I'll misrepresent it, Carl, but I think you start with lots of ideas, subject them to a series of filters, and the best ideas emerge from that. But something very similar, you have all these teams kind of saying, here's what we want to do with AI, but you can't pursue all of them. So now the filters might be for each of those, what's the ROI for the business, and do we have the data assets for it, and so on. I think that's one interesting way to proceed. I think that works. I've actually seen that done with companies. The other, and this is very tactical and somewhat in the weeds and detailed, but it's really interesting. I found lots of companies have this misconception about what the data science team or what the AI team should look like. And many of them think you hire a few data scientists and you're done. But in my experience, data scientists need a lot of support. And so you need a lot of data engineers. And so sometimes, and often, in fact, for one data scientist, you might have 3-4 data engineers who have to do a lot of the data prep and so on, and that's so much of the work. So I think there's a lot of those kinds of tactical things also one needs to think through.
If I could ask a follow-up, because you guys went from, what should AI be to where should we use in our business? Once you determined, okay, I want to use AI in this part of my business, maybe you guys can tell us like a horror story, like this is not the way to incorporate something in your business, or this resulted in huge pushback from the team, or how do you manage that process of changing a business process to now have certain aspects of it automated by some piece of software, be it bought or built?
Maybe one quick answer, and then I do want to make sure others get.
I would say the 30-second answer is, by and large, I think building is really hard today. While Kartik talked about all the trends of the technology getting easier, in my experience, 95% plus of all the build programs fail. So, I'm oversimplifying that, but I would say the bar and capabilities you need to have to do that is very high. I think the BART side, it's very vendor specific. It's hard to make a generalization. You have to run a process to find the right vendor and the right sort of engagement model.
So one horror story I can share, which happened with a client, it was in a customer service chatbot. And few of the customers who were chatting with the bot, they couldn't get the answer they were looking for, so they started abusing the bot and then abusing the company. So, that's one example I can think of right now.
Yeah, let's take more questions. Yes, back there. The lady there. Yeah.
Thank you, Kartik, Stacy, Ashu, and Gaurav. This is a fabulous conversation. This is what I spend my day thinking about these issues. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the guardrails and adaptability of these models. And to give you some context on my question, my role at LinkedIn is designing the tools ecosystem for our org. I'm holding it down. Okay. It's cutting out. So my goal is to design the optimal tools ecosystem for our global sales org to drive productivity. And that is answering the question, what are the tools that drive ROI and use cases and the minimal set? And from a global standpoint, there's a number of challenges of what does that mean across B2B SaaS and media businesses? How do you scale these at so that the models are both adaptable to be best in class in a rapidly evolving marketplace globally and regionally relevant? So So I'd love to hear your thoughts on adaptability of models in rapidly changing environments at a regional level as well.
That's why you shouldn't build, you should buy. On a serious note, that is one of the things that makes this so hard. I think, in theory, you can get together a bunch of data scientists, get half a dozen data engineers, throw in a couple of Python folks, and you think you can build a data science or a machine learning team very quickly. The challenge is the ongoing maintenance, management, and deployment of these models is very complex. I mean, just to take the recruiting example, if you think about building a model for every human being in the planet, in the grand scheme it's only, it's 7 billion models, so it's not that many models. But each model is a pipeline of models. And so effectively we have probably something in the order of 1 trillion models that combine to managing a model of every human being. Now you take every job, give or take, we have another 1 trillion models. And these models are changing every day because people are changing. So the complexity, I think, is, there's no short answer. I wish I had a better answer for you. I think by and large, this is left to the professionals, and you should outsource for now. And then over time, I think the infrastructure to enable that to be done at scale, I think will be more widely available. But we're probably 5 years away, is my guess, from being able to do it in-house at a scalable way.
Well, see, the way I look at it, whether you build or buy, whoever is building that model has to solve that problem, and that problem remains. And it's a classic problem with, any modeling task, that if you're trying to build a model that works at the population level, at the subpopulation level, you'll kind of struggle. One way to address it is to build models for regional markets and so on. But, I don't think that I have a silver bullet for that. There's no
one
easy
problem
solution.
which we face, and it comes to LinkedIn Sales Navigator, and it takes me back to Ashu's original point, which was about objective tasks, right? So if we look at LinkedIn Sales Navigator and how at least my sales team uses it, is that they'll reach out to a potential audience, and today they have to, if they just use LinkedIn Sales Navigator, they have to manually send an invite to everyone, include a message, and then wait for them to accept, and then send them a follow-on message. Now, if there was an automation tool, and there are a few which we use, if I name them, you'll shut them down, so I won't name them, because they use scraping and they use the browser to do that. But if LinkedIn was to build a tool which will work globally, I think solving problems like these, which are, I think, be it selling to a US B2B business or an Indian business or anywhere globally, generating leads, reaching out to people, that process remains the same. So solving that, automating that might be a good way to look at it.
Are you building tools to sell, for LinkedIn to sell, or are you building tools for the LinkedIn sales team?
So my question is more just contextually, like LinkedIn or large enterprise X, if you're optimizing your operations to combine and scale multiple lines of business, and you need a standardized tool ecosystem that is dependent on data to provide intelligent and contextually relevant insights to users, whether they are sales or marketing professionals, I would love to hear your thoughts on generalizability and adaptability in evolving markets.
So I'll give my old school answer, which is don't stay in the four walls of your office and your team and build stuff. Spend time in the field with the users that you're building for on a very regular basis, because you can't really, data is super valuable, and that's what we're talking about, but there are some just anecdotal evidence of what is powerful and what works and what's changing that you can learn by spending face-to-face time with what those users are doing on a regular basis that you're trying to help optimize.
Let's take a few more questions. Irina, we have to wrap up at 8, is it? Or sooner, 8. So we have 8 minutes. We'll do 8 questions, 1-minute answers each. Yes.
I'll try to make this a quick question, but what I thought was super interesting about the premise of this panel was that you can scale up some things like customer acquisition. Kartik, you mentioned like Ben Silberman's 5,000 emails for Pinterest for customer development. And what what I've seen is that those things seem like you can't scale them up through machine intelligence. For example, I worked at ad tech at Facebook, touched basically all parts of the ad tech stack, and I know a lot of the ad tech, martech companies that were mentioned. And what happens a lot of time in ad tech is you have like essentially over competition for that same amount of inventory. So customer acquisition costs just go through the roof. It seems like you can't scale that. In customer development, even if you scale things like customer support through Zendesk, as a founder, it seems like that would be very difficult to scale the customer development piece of that for future roadmaps as well. So I'm kind of curious to get your guys' sense of that.
Well,
I have to
can you
admit,
just
I don't
summarize the
understand the question. It was an interesting observation.
Yeah.
Can you actually scale things like customer acquisition at scale? Can you scale things like Ben Silberman's work with customers through automation, or are those things just fundamentally not scalable?
I think something like Ben Silberman's things with customer, I think it can be scaled. It will not have the efficacy of actually a person emailing each of these 5,000 people. But that's also the premise of something like SalesLoft and many of these tools, including Gainsight, is what I was thinking about. The idea being to retain these customers. You kind of look at their usage patterns. You send them automated messages that are personalized based on their usage patterns and so on. And if you're able to personalize, it's not clear to the customer that this is a human, this is a system. And if you can get that level of a personal touch, then based on their responses, you might then escalate and say, now this is time for a human being to come in. But that's what many of these tools like Gainsight and many others, SalesLoft and others, are trying to do, which is either to make the human who's interacting with the customer more efficient, or to add a layer before the human needs to come in, so that the human, instead of interacting with 1,000 people, interacts with the 20 where the automation isn't working. So I do believe it's doable. It'll never be as efficient, or as effective as a human reaching out to each person, but it'll be far more efficient.
But this goes to what I was just saying. I think in the Pinterest example, he was trying to find product market fit, right? Yeah. So it wasn't just like, hey, do you like the product? Do you like the product? Yes, no, okay, now I have my data. Here's what they like and don't like. He was intellectually engaging in conversations where he was working towards something that I think would be hard to replicate through a machine, right? But once he got it and built something that everybody loves, and now we know, spend time, when things are changing a lot, it takes some intelligence that I don't know machines will ever have. But once you get to, okay, now it's repeatable, now, man, I want my sales development reps saying every time they get this objection, I want them to say this. And I can't even train them to do that, but a machine can do that for them. So then I think we can automate it. But I personally don't think machines will ever be able to get to some of those intellectual processes that had to happen for him to get to product market fit.
Talking about your first part of the question, which was customer acquisition and the Facebook ad cap example you gave. Now, there is no silver bullet to that, but we have faced that problem in Google search, where one of our clients, a regional pest control player, a niche space, the highest spender on Google in that space. And they wanted to spend more, but like you faced, the ROI was going negative if we spend more on Google. So we took a multi-channel approach there. We tried to grow their audience coming to the website so that we could do dynamic retargeting. We bucketed the remarketing lists and started targeting people basis where they were dropping out. Started using email heavily, SMS, push notifications. So multi-channel is the approach we took, and we were able to solve that problem for them in terms of scaling.
Okay, so we have 2 minutes. Maybe squeeze in one more question, or 2 minutes of applause, whatever you guys want. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I lead M&A for a large enterprise company, and when I look at all these new age young AI companies, I think the fundamental is they just don't have the data at their disposal, right? So the question is, what's the point of insertion for these companies? Because we own the data, they don't. They own the technology. In the light of today's privacy around customer data, very central to, to the actually enterprise. How do these companies really differentiate themselves? How do they themselves?
So I actually disagree with your fundamental premise. Enterprise software companies store the data on behalf of their customers. They don't own the data. Salesforce actually has no rights to commingle data across even two customers. So I actually think traditional enterprise software companies, for a host of reasons, are going to be unable to make the transition to AI. I think this data asset is a myth. Data is actually, in the grand scheme of things, not that hard to find. You have to deliver value. And every AI company has to find a point of insertion, coming back to you have to find that 10% that you can automate, and the trade is you trade data for value. And, we do that as consumers. I mean, people don't like personalized ads on YouTube, but, well, you want to pay $20 a month for YouTube. That's the trade. Ads for a free service. That's also true in enterprise. You get, in recruiting, you may get some value from the step of the recruiting process, in return for which you commingle your data, and incrementally, machine learning and AI companies are building data moats. But in the grand scheme of things, I think data moats is a little bit of a myth. There's actually many, many ways. Most data sets can be acquired relatively easily, and the size of the data sets required to train these models is coming down exponentially as well.
Okay, I think we're going to end it here. Carl, any closing remarks? All right. All right. Well, I thank you all for being here, and I thank the panelists for taking the trouble. Gaurav, you flew in from Philly, so thanks in particular, but to Ashu and Stacy as well. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Buy his book.